This valley was absolutely alive with the tinkling of geological hammers on rocks. 6 hours later, the group would get home, and Mrs. Brew would say, "How was Christmas at the top?" "Look at this beautiful skeleton I just dug out." The pre-Australopithecus africanus. And that's what we're bent on finding at the moment, and that's why our dig, straddled by this table, is going down to the proximal end of the femur.
So would that show different features?
Yes. And this was in contrast with the chimpanzee, which had a more retreating brow and a much flatter forehead, and Dart drew attention to that feature.
As a speaker, he's amazing to listen to.
One of the greatest lecturers I've come across.
After making him, the mold was destroyed.
I was born in Durban, in Natal, South Africa, on the Indian Ocean coast, a hot and humid part of the world. It was 1925, the year that the Prince of Wales visited South Africa, the year that the Taung skull was announced to the world, and I grew up there and spent the first well, let me see, about the first 10 or 12 years of my life there. I think my childhood wasn't especially happy. My family was more or less on the rocks. The marriage of my parents was breaking up. Economically, we were not well off, and father had some bad troubles economically and went bankrupt. So I think back to days of unhappiness as a youngster, and I was a very sensitive boy, and these things seem to have hit me quite hard. We had to give up our house and go and live in a rather second-rate boarding house. We didn't have a particularly happy time, my late sister and myself. Our childhood could not be described really as a happy, carefree one. Perhaps it gave me a rather serious turn of mind, which I think I've had for much of my life. Some people think I've been too serious, and other people think that I'm always cracking jokes, so I'm not quite sure which one of them is correct. My father had a toy shop in West Street, Durban, and then the bazaars started up, the OK bazaars and the DB bazaars and the C2C bazaars and so on, and he could not compete with them, and his business went down, and ultimately he had to shut up shop and in fact left for Johannesburg to see whether he could make a go of life up there. I was left with my sister and mother in Durban, and it was a rather trying and difficult period in one's life, not having a man there in the household while I was growing up through my early teen years. I look back with the greatest of respect and gratitude and admiration to the men who were my school teachers at Durban High School. Men like Charlie Evans, who taught us history, and Neville Bowden, who taught us Latin, Neville Nuttall, who was a superb English teacher, and to whom I think I I attribute my love of the English language. Charlie Evans I'm indebted to for my love of history, and these two loves have kept with me all my life. I must have learned to read at a very young age. I remember when I was 3, the family used to make me read the newspaper to the visitors. I didn't always know or understand what I was reading, but I was able to read the words. And I think that side of my brain, the side that uses and comprehends words, it's just over on this side of the brain, this left hemisphere, must have been rather well developed to have been so precociously hard at it. When I left school, right at the end of my high school days, I still hadn't fully made up my mind what I wanted to do. Weeks after I matriculated, I decided to apply for medicine, but it was about the 3rd or 4th of my choices. It wasn't my first choice by any manner of means. In the 2nd year, I fell under the spell of some remarkable teachers. Raymond Dart was my anatomy chief, and under him were several outstanding men. There was Joe Gilman, who really first sparked my interest in research, and there was Laurie Wells, afterwards head of anatomy at the University of Cape Town, and also Sandy Galloway, who went on to become Professor of Anatomy and the first Dean of the Medical School of Kampala in Uganda. Dart's impact on me, which most people think of as the most seminal event, the most critical event in my career, came much later. The earlier impact was that of these senior lecturers under Dart. My late sister died in 1942. She was 21 years of age. She died in diabetic coma. And I spoke to my teachers about this, and Joe Gilman said, if you're going to go into genetics, you must get in at the ground floor, which is the chromosomes, those little bearers of the hereditary particles, the genes. And so in my 3rd year, my medical BSc year, as we call it, and in the honours year that followed, I worked on chromosomes. Long before fossils turned me on, chromosomes turned me on. I've always looked back with deep appreciation to my parents. Although we were as poor as church mice, they gave me my head. They said, if you want to take 2 extra years to do this medical science and honours course, it's your decision. We think you're crazy, but you're welcome to have a bash at it. But fortunately, I was able to win bursaries and scholarships right through my university education. And secondly, I did a lot of writing, often under a nom de plume, and earned my expenses. I came back from my medical BSc and honours year to continue with my medical studies, but carried on with my links in the anatomy department, and indeed Professor Dart appointed me an instructor, part-time instructor in anatomy each year of the remaining years of my medical studies, and this did help to pay my way through the medical school. I was about to embark on my internship when Dart offered me a position on his staff. The decision was, as it were, taken for me, and I became a member of staff in the Department of Anatomy, little knowing that within 8 years I would succeed Dart to the chair of anatomy. Well, he was a major factor in my life, almost a father figure in later years, a dear friend. There were times when we had moments of difficulty, especially early in my career, when he must have seen me as a little bit of an upstart. On one occasion, he picked up a 3-legged stool, trying to illustrate the point of how many millions of years it's taken us to acquire skill. And to illustrate skill, he picked up the stool and threw it through a closed window. Now, I don't know what the students learnt of anatomy from him, but they'll certainly never forget how man came upright and how stools can be thrown through closed windows with consummate skill. He was a remarkable actor.
You're in the presence of the Makapansgat cave, actually the quarry that leads to it. It was first came to my notice in 1925 when bones were sent to me from this place by a school teacher at Petersburg, a Mr. Eitzmann. And it became very famous later because of its association of these fossils with Australopithecines. No less than 13 specimens of Australopithecines were represented by fragments that came from this area.
The number of people that he stimulated and inspired was quite remarkable. I believe his great contribution has been the men and women that he made. He was a great maker of persons in science. He fired and stimulated many people and set their feet along the path of research. And I'm proud to number myself amongst them as one of his protégés.
Well, one of Dart's biggest attributes, I think, was his love of people. Although he used to jump up and down and make noises, he loved people.
Alan has become the world's most experienced excavator of the hard, intractable rocks of the dolomitic limestone cave deposits in which our ape men are discovered. He opened up the site of Makapansgat following an earlier excavation there by James Kitching. He is still working on the half-day basis on the staff of the Palaeoanthropology Research Unit and is still in charge of the dig at Sterkfontein. Really left his mark in the history of South African anthropology. And it's very fitting that the Monuments Commission of South Africa has proclaimed this a protected site. From 1984 onwards, the legislation was repealed, and once again the universities are free to admit whomever they wish. And since that time, the numbers of black students at Wits University have risen very steeply. Something like 25% at the present time are students of colour, and on all my expeditions in the field, the children seem to take to me like a duck to water, and one sometimes feels one finds one's way into the hearts of their parents through the children. one may imagine that early hominids, early members of the family of man, would have been terrified by the lightning, the thunder of these vigorous storms that hit the high veld, that lightning, that earth tremors, that hailstorms would have driven them cowering into the shelter of a nearby rock overhang, long before they had become confirmed cave dwellers. One would imagine that these elements of fear and terror could have played a major part in catalyzing the development of their later mentality, because at this level they had no culture. They did not wear their culture like an overcoat to protect them from blatant, naked exposure to the elements. And because of that, they were animal, although they were hominids. Much later, their humanity became a part of the picture. Much later, culture entered into the picture. They began to speak. They began to think beyond the needs of the here and now. And maybe a spiritual realm entered into their evolution at quite an early stage, and burial of the dead and other signs of fossilized ritual enter into the picture. But now, at this level, 3 million years ago, Australopithecus had not reached that stage. He was naked and animal on the face of the earth. This entrance quarry of the Makapanscot lime works was bristling with activity. There were lime workers excavating a great seam of limestone in this quarry that was needed for the new gold extracting process which had been introduced some years before on the Witwatersrand. And Mr. Eitzman of the Petersburg High School, a schoolmaster, came down, and standing in that very position, he spotted layers of bones in front of him, just about at eye level, as he described it to us. And he sent some of these down to Dart because he'd read in the papers about the Tong discovery only a couple of months earlier. Eitzman sent these fossil bones down to Dart in 1925, the very year of the Tong discovery. Nothing much happened, though, for about 4 years after that, until the British Association for the Advancement of Science came out here to meet jointly with its South African counterpart, and on a great safari to the north, they came through here. There were people like Julian Huxley and Caton Thompson and others, along with the South African counterparts, and they visited the site. But as far as we can tell, nothing was seen, nothing was observed. And so the next chapter moves us forward to about 1936-37, when von Ritlow and Malone found stone tools in the Cave of Hearths. Von Ritlow and Malone worked at a site about a mile away from the Makapanscot lime works, and it was a site to which the name Cave of Hearths was given. It's called that because within the cave they discovered fossil fireplaces, the oldest fossil fireplaces known in Africa up until that time, hence the name Cave of Hearths. They also found superbly preserved stone hand axes of the African Acheulean culture in that cave, and for a time it was one of the most exciting and important cave discoveries in southern Africa. Some years later, when I was a medical science student at Wits University, a group of friends and I decided that we wanted to undertake a field expedition during our winter July vacation. I went to von Ritlow and he said, "I've got the ideal place for you, Makapanscot. There's interest there for the botanist, the zoologist, the anatomy and anthropology student, and also for geology students. So up we came, and we were entrusted with a specific problem that they wanted us to solve. Van Ritlo and Dart said, we want to know whether the site where Eitzmann got his bones in 1925 was the same site as that from which Van Ritlo and Malon had got their stone implements in 1938, or are they two different sites? And that was the big problem we set out to solve, and indeed we did solve it. They were two totally different sites, the one much older than the other. Well, we worked here for about 10 days, the party of students, in that cold winter. He brought back a very large and beautiful horse mandible, or lower jaw, that came out of the cave, and a number of other specimens, and now we'd solved the problem. The lime works was where Eitzmann got his bones, and the cave of Hearths up here was where Van Ritlo and Berry Malon had got their stone tools. The cave of Hearths itself was excavated subsequently by Revel Mason. During that student expedition, we dug out a number of stone tools from this position here, material that had collapsed along a weakness plane, and these were very lovely, very beautiful tools of a period dated, we now know, to something like 100 to 150,000 years. And after that, and subsequent to World War II, Revel Mason came up here and spent some years of his life doing one of the biggest excavations that's ever been done in southern Africa in an archaeological cave. And he found a whole succession of layers preserved inside the cave. There was the very recent, if we can go from today back to yesterday, the present day surface. It had Iron Age assegais in it. It had bullets from skirmishes that had taken place in this area, and then back to microlithic small tools such as were made by Bushmen, and then earlier still the so-called Middle Stone Age, and lower down layers accumulated in African Acheulean times, the Stone Age of the Middle Pleistocene. And so we have a record here of perhaps 250,000 years of human prehistory coming right up to interface with history during that siege episode of 1854. One of the most remarkably complete records of that time period that we have anywhere. One of the most exciting things that Van Ritlo discovered here when he started approaching this cave was the earliest fireplace or fossil hearth, which you see here right on the travertine floor of the cave. And these are layers of ash built up, approximately 1.5 meters, 1.75 meters deep. There are burnt bones inside the fossil ash layers, and there are a few stone tools like this very nice cleaver, which is made out of a kind of rock which is not found in the walls of the cave or the roof of the cave, so it is an artificial importation into the cave. And here it is as part of the African Acheulean culture, part of the oldest habitation level within the Cave of Hearths. In my second year of medicine, when I was an anatomy student receiving lectures from Wells and Galloway in physical anthropology, that really sparked my interest. It was that that led me into the idea of looking at human evolution, at fossil man, at earlier kinds of ape men like Australopithecus. So it dates back, I suppose one might say, to my second year as a medical student, and then was greatly intensified in my third year as a medical BSc student, working in a department where the great discovery of the missing link had been made. There were many things that early hominids had to learn on their path to modern humanity. For one thing, how to prepare their food. There's no doubt that at the level of Australopithecus, most of the food preparation took place inside the mouth. And we have large, very large, expanded cheek teeth, the premolars and the molars. In the fullness of time, when stone tools appear, it seems pretty clear that a lot of the food preparation was done outside of the mouth, and one finds the beginnings of reduction of tooth size at that time. And still later, the discovery and the taming of fire were two most critical events in man's development, because fire gave him warmth. Fire gave him security from the wild beasts. Fire gave him darkness turning into light. Fire gave him probably a wider range of foodstuffs that he could use, because many of the berries and the fruits that grow around here are poisonous until one cooks them, and then one denatures the poison, one breaks down the toxin, and so it's very likely that with fire there came a widening of the range of food possibilities in the chain of food in this Makapansgat area. That was one of the many things, fire. There were other things that came, the development of hunting, giving up just scavenging on rotten carcasses and hunting animals down yourself. You had to be fleet of foot, you had to have good eyesight, you had to have good, skilled hands and activities based upon them. And then also one finds extraordinary new elements entering into the picture. Elements like the birth of ritual. One sees it at Shukutian, just outside Beijing, the famous cave of Peking Man, who not only had fireplaces in the cave, but he collected heads. He had a head cult. And many of those heads have got bases which have been opened as though to give access to the contents. Perhaps they were ritual cannibals that ate the brain to convey some of the qualities of the dead person to the living. But that kind of thing, and with burial of the dead and sprinkling of red ochre on the dead, red the color of blood, seems to have been a later development in man's evolution. And he couldn't have done those things unless he could communicate them to the next generation. Otherwise they would have been flashes in the pan of no evolutionary significance. And so speech, spoken language, communication seems to have been a critically important aspect, a sine qua non for the development of these other spiritual faculties, including, I may add, art on the walls of the caves, engraving of art on the stones in areas where there weren't caves. Speech, spoken language, it seems to me, is perhaps the most critical single advance in the whole history of mankind. As long ago as 1980, I had the temerity to suggest that Homo habilis was the first hominid able to speak, at a time when many of my colleagues were suggesting that spoken language didn't come until relatively recently, about 150, 200,000 years ago. The evidence on which I based that viewpoint was the marks and configurations on the surface of the brain casts, the pattern of convolutions and fissures which we find in the human brain and which is absolutely distinctive from those of apes, could first be identified, I found, in the brain cast of Homo habilis. Not only, though, convolutions and fissures, but also, for the first time, the two major spoken language centres put in their appearance in Homo habilis. There's one called Broca's area on the left side of the frontal lobe of the brain. It was described first by a Frenchman, Pierre Broca, in 1861. There's another one in the lower part of the parietal lobe of the brain, which was described by a German investigator in 1884, Wernicke's area. We don't have those in apes, and we don't have them in Australopithecus. But when one comes to the brain cast of Homo habilis, for the first time, those two telltale areas of the brain cast are present. And it is my belief and my claim that Homo habilis already possessed the neurological basis of spoken language and was the first hominid so to do. I've been for many, many years, several decades now, deeply fascinated by the brain and its workings. I've got a little book on the evolution of the brain, and I've published and researched a lot on that subject. So perhaps psychiatry might have been an alternative to pediatrics had I gone into practice. I suppose it's been a very rewarding alternative to have been teaching doctors and paramedical, allied medical personnel. I think I've had something like 6,000 young doctors pass through my hands over these last 40 or so years that I've been teaching, and that's been a very rich and rewarding experience. This was the first specimen that came to light at Makapanscot. It's the back of a cranium, that part over there. And so we've got parts of the parietal bones and parts of the occipital bone. There's the anterior superior iliac spine. All of you anatomists know all these things. I don't need to rub them in. Here is the auricular surface for the sacrum. On the 40th anniversary of Dr. Broom's first visit to Stokefontein, Mr. Hughes found the first fragments on that very day, the 40th anniversary day, of what has turned out to be the first Homo habilis, a more advanced hominid. Looking for the clues in a whodunit is very like looking for the clues in interpreting a fossil, or its way of life, or what it looked like, or what its sex was, or its age, what kind of person was represented. I think the same faculty of the mind that likes probing that sort of thing, likes looking at the clues that a Lord Peter Wimsey or a Inspector General Roderick Allen in Nio Marshes, or Hercule Poirot devotes his attention to in looking at clues in a murder case. So I love those. I've got hundreds of them on my shelf. And so that's the way the little child was lying, down on its right, a little bit off-center, looking down towards the ground in that fashion. That's how one can reconstruct that layer of calcite. It was the floor of a little cave inside the Calvaria. Good afternoon. Very interesting to read the lives of people close to my own field. The autobiographies of Dart, of Broom, of Leakey, of Sir Arthur Keith, people of that ilk. They throw a lot of light on the history of the subject, what made the chaps tick who generated the ideas or the discoveries. I've never found time to acquire a wife. Now, there are those who say that's a strength and others who say that's a weakness. It sometimes can be very lonely without having a helpmeet, as it were. I've been married to the medical school, say unkind friends. Others say, well, what can you expect of a workaholic? But I don't accept that I'm a workaholic. I tell you why, because I think a workaholic is a person who is neurotically driven to be working all the time. It's a kind of neurosis. This is the famous Buxton Lime Works at Taung in southern Africa, the site where 65 years ago there was discovered the first of all Africa's missing links. A little skull of a child, perhaps not more than 3 to 4 years of age when it died, a skull which fell into the hands of Professor Raymond Dart at the University of the Witwatersrand, and there, in his study of the child, he recognized that it was close to membership of the family of man, the hominids. It was the beginning of a great chapter in Africa's contribution to palaeoanthropology. In 1988, we started a new excavation here, and we are at present excavating to try to find more specimens of that same hominid, to try to determine the age more precisely, and to clear up some other problems. The monument we put up here at Taung marks, as nearly as we can determine it, the exact spot where the Taung skull was discovered in 1924. I designed it as a pyramid because I wanted it to stand as long as the pyramids have lasted. And this is, as far as the pinnacle goes, the nearest that we could find to the level at which the discovery was made, and also the whereabouts at that level at which the find was made. There are many instances pointing to the high antiquity of the spiritual domain, the spiritual dimension in human evolution. It goes back, I think, for 500,000 years. It becomes intensified within the last 100,000 years when burial of the dead starts.
I came to Taung as a volunteer for an Earthwatch program in the United States, and it means a lot to me because I'm an anthropology student at a university in the States, and I hope this is where my career will be sort of embedded in the archaeological side of anthropology.
As an anatomy student from the University of the Witwatersrand, we study paleoanthropology, and being so close to Taung, I think would literally be a sin not to come and see where the first Australopithecine skull was found.
I think it is essential for our future to delve into the past.
I actually took a year off from medicine to do this degree because I wanted more of an insight into man's ancestry. I'm fascinated the way in which man has evolved, and I would also like to perhaps try and find a link between paleoanthropology and religion, because I think that there is one.
I think the more people engage in the study of the past, the more we'll understand ourselves better, and then the more we'll enrich even our religion. So I think it's really important that we should encourage other people to study anthropology and paleoanthropology. By so doing, we'll actually help ourselves.
Deep down inside, a lot of people are actually very interested in where we came from. You know, whether they deny it or not, or whether they say it, I'm sure that everyone would like. I mean, I was adopted, and I can't deny the fact that I'm interested in who my real parents are.
I propose that the reason for many of, say, the evils in the world, many of the downfalls of our modern society, can be ascribed to the fact that we haven't paid enough attention, or that most of us haven't paid enough attention to our spirituality.
Eventually, you try and come up with your own deductions, which I'm still looking for.
I think a valuable lesson one can learn from all these studies is that we all had a common ancestor, and I think that can go a long way in dissolving the race barriers.
It's associated with the birth of art. One finds the rock paintings, the engravings, the sculpturings coming into the picture at the time when religion is most highly flourishing in the early evolution of man. Another dimension is there.
I see society and the emphasis on mechanization and the physical world as a major distraction.
We have become a believing people, a species with the capacity to have an ethic. Waddington spoke about us as an ethicizing people. We don't inherit a religion, but we inherit a brain which has the capacity for conceiving of religion.
His spiritual evolutionary pattern also needs to evolve. And for me, the starting point was anthropological studies.
Belief in a God heightens the sensitivity, the awareness of the spiritual realm. The two things are almost synonymous in my thinking. So the two go together. I certainly do think that a greater awareness of a spiritual realm in life is the direction in which human evolution of the future is likely to pursue. If we look at the recent past, we find increasing evidence of the importance of the spiritual realm in human development over the last tens of thousands of years, perhaps as much as 100,000 years.
My anthropological studies have put it into perspective to a certain extent. It has placed me on a long lineage that stretches over many years and made me feel I'm not that important, and this entire generation is not important.
I believe that the great secret of life is constantly to be aspiring, constantly to be traveling, but traveling hopefully. Although there may be carnage and pillage and wreckage all around one, which is what on one's bad days one sees in today's society, nevertheless there is a road ahead, and I am optimistic enough, I am hopeful enough, I have sufficient faith to believe that we are moving beyond the wreckage of today's civilization towards something better.
Man has to evolve spiritually. It is of necessity, spiritual evolution.
Religion is a very real thing. It's not in contradiction with science. I don't believe the Bible was meant to be a textbook of biology. It is a textbook of ethical, sublime ethical principles.
I don't think there's any conflict between God and science. It is God who is the supreme scientist.
Such a thing as a hearing-impaired person at university in South Africa was totally unknown at that time. His father contacted the principal of the university, who was then Mr. Rakes, and he knew that he had in Professor Dart a person extremely sympathetic to those handicapped, and he said to Professor Dart, "I want you to get Robert Simmons a degree." And so Dart took on the challenge, but I had just joined the staff as a young lecturer under Dart, and Dart called me into his office and said, "I want you to get Robert Simmons a degree." And so Robert became a personal protege of mine, and for something just short of 40 years, I have been very close to Robert in the progress of his work. He became the first ever South African student, totally deaf from birth, to complete a Bachelor of Science degree.
Well, I think the reason why there's so few people really interested in anthropology is because it's not taught from an early age. You don't hear about anthropology when you're at school. I mean, you learn about history, you learn about the wars, you learn about famous people in history, but you don't learn about Australopithecans and the man from Java, and you don't hear about that at school. Whereas if it was started at an earlier age, if children heard about it at school, you might create more of an interest.
Man's physical or biological evolution has been continuing over the past 5 million years or so. It's only within the last million years that his cultural evolution has started to shape man's future.
Although I am very conscious of the spiritual realm in life, I believe there are still question marks in my own thinking.
Taung has a very special significance for me after working here for the past 3 field seasons. But I think its significance lies in its importance to everybody, for it's here at Taung that our common ancestor was found. Common ancestor to the people of Africa, to the people of America. And it's this type of discovery that's going to bring us together. We find out that we have more in common than we originally thought.
The moment when all question marks disappear is a moment of cerebral fossilization. I believe and hope that I will die still wondering about the answers to that kind of question. People often ask me, why am I so interested in the past? Why am I probing man's ancestry in this almost obsessional way? I believe that there are several answers to that question, but above all, we are perhaps the most curious species in creation. We have this innate desire to know. Curiosity is the mark of all the mammals. It is a priori the mark of the primates. And above all else, it is the mark of man. But there are other reasons as well. Perhaps another good reason is that we may be able to draw lines out of the past leading up to the present, a kind of graph of our development. And then, perhaps, leading still further, we may extrapolate those lines into the future and get some idea of where man is going. And there's yet another thought that occurs to me. Perhaps also we should think about the message that man's knowledge of himself may bring to man's knowledge of the other species on Earth. If we can understand our own ecology and how we have adapted to our environment, maybe we shall be in a stronger position to understand the essence of ecology and the greening of our society. Maybe these are some of the reasons why there is no more fascinating, no more tantalizing problem in all mankind's probings than his origins and his evolution.